Yeah, so thank you all for joining. And I'm very happy to welcome tonight's speaker. Her name is Antonia Gefahrt, and her social media handle, which is very important nowadays, it's Sci for Veganism. And as far as I understand it, you're mostly active on Instagram, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
LinkedIn as well, a little bit.
I'll post the social media handle into the chat afterwards. Tonight's presentation by Antonia is based on her master thesis in psychology that she did at the University of Salzburg, and she's currently doing a PhD that further deepens this line of research. Antonia has previously presented a similar talk 2025, so last summer, at the International Animal Rights Conference in Luxembourg, and just a few months ago at the Animal Rights Conference here in Vienna, where I also met her for the first time in person. And tonight's talk will follow a similar structure, as far as I understand it, with some additional in-depth discussions of certain parts. And of course, afterwards, as opposed to most conferences, we'll have a lot of time for an extensive Q&A session afterwards. So this gives us the opportunity to explore the topic in much more detail. Yeah. And with that, I'll hand things over to you, Antonia. Yeah, please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. Is it right,
Yeah,
Paul?
looks good.
Perfect. So, yeah, thank you again for the introduction. Thank you also for having me. And thanks everyone for joining. Hi, everyone. Yeah, welcome to my presentation. Abolitionism versus New Welfarism. It is a topic that brings about quite strong opinions, which is why I want to say a few words before we get started. I think it is fair to say that all of us, as we are present here today, want a world in which animals are no longer killed, exploited, or made to suffer for human benefit. Please give me a thumbs up if that at least describes 90% of your goal. I am aware that there are people who are more focused on suffering, others more on exploitation, but I think the overlap is really substantial. And considering that we are such a small minority in this world, yeah, I think we should acknowledge this and also appreciate this, at least I do. Now, how to get to this vegan world or to this goal is, of course, another question. And in an experiment, I compared those two communication strategies. And today I will speak about the findings. But I'm also really looking forward to discussing this with you, learning about different perspectives as well, and maybe, yeah, taking away a few new things as well. So with that being said, let's get started. Yeah, Paul already did a great job introducing myself, so I can actually jump over this. Maybe I want to add really my mission and in life and my research focus as well for my doctoral studies is to optimize communication strategies for vegan advocacy, or in other words, I try to answer the question, what's the best way to get us as close and as fast as possible to a vegan world? So, to get started, I'd like to invite you into a thought experiment. So, please imagine a continuum. Right in the middle are people who are omnivore by default, so who haven't really given the matter much thought as yet. Then, on the one hand, we have meat lovers. These are often people who don't like vegans too much. And on the other side is us as committed vegans. And then there are various stages in between. Now, I'd like you to think back to the last conversation you had with a non-vegan person. So your last persuasion attempt, maybe. And to locate this person on this continuum, like where was this person before your conversation and where afterwards? And also what likely happened in the hours, days, or weeks after your conversation. Now, what if this isn't a straight line, but a pyramid? What happens now when people take their first initial steps towards either side is that it suddenly becomes much more easy to continue going down that way rather than changing your mind, which would mean that you have to climb back up first to get to the other side. And in fact, the metaphor of the pyramid is used in psychology to describe what often happens when people make a choice or take a decision. Because what we as humans often do is that we come up with a lot of arguments to convince ourselves that our choice was the right one. And that way we go down all the way on our side of the pyramid and become more and more entrenched in our own views. So what this all has to do with vegan advocacy now? Well, looking at this as a pyramid made me appreciate these small steps towards our side a little bit more, thinking that maybe gravity will actually do part of the job for us. But it made me also pay a little bit more attention to the other side and think about how can we prevent these counterproductive effects. So speaking of strategy, there are two people I'd like you to meet, Abby and Nebe. Abby and Nebe are two animal rights activists who share the goal of a vegan world, but their approaches differ. So Abby is an abolitionist animal rights activist. She read all of Professors Gary Francione and Anna Charlton's books, and here's a little snippet of how she communicates.
Hi, I'm Abby. I believe that we have a moral obligation to live vegan, as there is no need to consume animal products. Ultimately, it's all about taste. But can a temporary sensory pleasure morally justify the exploitation and death of sentient beings? My answer is a clear no. What's yours?
Now, Neve, she completed all of the online courses from Dr. Melanie Joy. And also here is a small snippet of how she communicates.
Hi, I'm Niwi. I believe that everyone can contribute to a better world, even if it's just a small step. A lot could be achieved if everyone were just a little more vegan, or simply as vegan as they feel they can be. How vegan can you be?
So, there are a few differences, but also commonalities. First of all, the asks differ, also the moral standards, and then the method as well. Abby uses very logical arguments and very philosophical arguments, whereas Neve uses psychological strategies such as the foot in the door technique, which basically posits that when you start with such a small request like be as vegan as you can, that not only are people much more likely to comply with this one, which is kind of logical, but as a consequence, then they are also more likely to comply with larger requests later on, or even might implement changes into this direction by themselves. And then there is also an important commonality. Both of them try and communicate very friendly and are quite empathetic. So now the big question is, which strategy is the better one? And I'm actually really interested in what you think. And I thought to do this on a continuum as well. So if you like to share, if you think that Abby is 100% better, put a 0 in the chat. If you think Neva is 100% better, put a 10. 5 is not sure, it depends. And then, of course, you can choose any number in between to indicate that you are leaning towards the one or other side. Now I lost my chat. So let's see. Yeah, found it. 8. Okay. So we have one person leaning a little bit more towards Neve, someone else, then one person leaning towards Abby, again leaning towards Abby. Yeah, it's pretty balanced, I would say. I was definitely, and probably still am, a little bit in between. And this was also the reason why I really wanted to find out which strategy is better. I really remember that when I read the books by Gary Francione and Anna Charlton, I found it so convincing. And I really thought if someone had spoken to me like this at the time I hadn't been vegan yet, I would have pretty much turned vegan right away. But also with my psychological background, I also found Dr. Joy's approach it made a lot of sense to me, and I found it quite convincing. So yeah, I wanted to find out which strategy works better. So first I looked a little bit into related studies and existing research. There's quite a few studies on different requests and communication styles, but typically the results are a little bit mixed, and also only a few aspects of these communication styles are considered. So I thought there's definitely more research needed, which is why, as part of my master's thesis, I conducted an experiment comparing these two strategies. And today I will speak about my findings, specifically which strategy performed better and why. Also, whether or not there were any exceptions. And I will also introduce a theoretical model, which I believe can help us explain, predict, and maybe also optimize our communication. And I'd like to start with a theoretical model because to me it was really important to not only understand which strategy is better, but to really understand why. And I was looking for a theoretical model that could explain what brings people closer to veganism, but also what pushes them the other way. And I ended up with something called the social functional model of prejudice, which I adapted for vegan advocacy. It sounds a little bit complicated, but it's also not important. The model itself is actually quite straightforward. So what the model posits is that vegans and also vegan communication, vegan advocacy can pose various kinds of threats that lead to specific emotions and then to certain reactions. So one kind of threat is when people feel threatened in their rights and freedom and also in their autonomy to consume animal products. And I think we all know non-vegans complaining about us interfering with their business and telling them what and what not to do. And they are not too happy about this. Then some people are also concerned about their health when going vegan. And vegan worldviews can seem quite different, even incompatible, and this can also be a little bit threatening. So all this can lead to people getting angry, which then naturally has not so positive consequences. And here we are talking about maybe vegophobia, which is like a negative feeling towards vegans, or rejection of vegan products, or maybe even an increase in speciesist beliefs. Now, there is one more threat category, and this is morality threat, which is actually a good thing because morality threat translates to an awareness of injustice towards animals, like a feeling, oh my God, what we are doing here is actually utterly wrong. And this then can lead to feelings of guilt. And the good thing about guilt is that it often leads to reparative efforts. So that people want to make up or they want to make things better in the future. So here we are talking about favorable outcomes, which can be intentions and efforts to either reduce or, of course, ideally eliminate the consumption of animal products, so to go vegan. Now, based on this model, what were my predictions with regard to Abby and Nebe? Well, first of all, I thought Nebe, she has this very small request. She only asks people to go as vegan as they feel they can be. So I thought that should definitely pose the lesser threat in terms of rights, health, and worldviews, and therefore lead to less anger and less adverse outcomes. But then Abby, she makes it so clear that any consumption of animal products is totally morally reprehensible. So I thought that at least seems to have the potential to raise more awareness of injustice, which could then lead to more guilt and more favorable outcomes. And we will find out what actually happened. But first, I want to talk a little bit about my method. So I had 216 participants with varying degrees of animal product consumption. Most of them were from the UK. Now, these participants were in an online experiment randomly allocated to either the abolitionist or the new welfare strategy. And then first, they received a video message from either Abby or Nebe. Now, importantly, in the experiment, Abby and Nebe looked identical like this, and they shared the name Via. So they really only differed in their lines of argument. And then after the video, participants entered a chat and interacted freely with Via, who was instructed to either use an abolitionist or a new welfarist communication strategy. Now, to give you a little bit more context, so in the video, Neve introduced herself as Via, then she mentions her conistic past to establish a connection. She also talks about her personal motivations, and her primary motivation was the suffering of the animals, but she also mentions the environment. And then she highlights conistic defenses. Conistic defenses are basically what people do in order to be able to consume animal products while at the same time claiming that they care about animals. And one of these conistic defenses is basically what most people do when they eat animal products. They don't think of the animals they are derived from. And Nebe draws attention to this by saying, I remember that each time I took a bite of a cheese sandwich, I was reminded of the sad eyes of the animals I saw in that documentary. Then she also states that by now, already more than 50% of consumers in Europe have reduced their meat consumption. So what she does here is she emphasizes that there is already a majority doing this, and this majority is growing. And research shows that these kind of social norms are quite influential when it comes to behavior. And then she finishes off with a foot in the door technique, saying that a lot could be achieved if everyone was just a little more vegan, or simply as vegan as they feel they can be. Now, Abby, she also introduces herself as Via, and she mentions her conistic pause to establish a connection. And then she does even more. She explicitly states that her intention is not to attack anyone, and she also doesn't think of people who currently still eat animal products as bad. And then her basic argument is a syllogism. So she introduces her first premise, which is that in general, we should not impose unnecessary suffering on animals. Now, this is a very safe place to start because it's something nearly everyone agrees with. Then she continues with the second premise, which is all animal products involve death and suffering, and there is no necessity for humans to consume them. And then finally, she draws the conclusion that we have a moral obligation to live vegan, and that anything less would be morally reprehensible. And then she summarizes with a question: can a temporary sensory pleasure morally justify the suffering and death of sentient beings? Now, here the focus is a lot on food. However, the chatbot was also instructed to argue for the complete and immediate abolition of all animal use, so including cosmetics, entertainment, etc. And also to use animal-human analogies and consistency arguments. Now, Neve's chatbot, of course, was instructed to advocate for incremental changes and small steps, and to use the motivational interviewing technique, which is a well-established counseling style used to strengthen change motivation and intention. And all this is, of course, based on Joy and Francione and Charlton, respectively. So this was my intervention. And then before and after, I measured all the threats, emotions, reactions I was interested in. And then I looked at how these changed from before to after the intervention and how these changes differed in between the conditions. And the items I used were actually pretty straightforward. So for example, I measured anger, asking how much do you feel anger towards vegans. Now, one thing I should mention maybe that all the post measures were obtained directly after the intervention, except effort, which I measured a couple of weeks after the intervention. So here I just asked, how much have you now tried to either reduce or eliminate the consumption of animal products since your conversation with Via? So what did I find? First of all, I have some good news, or at least I think they are. So I also asked participants before the intervention how much they currently consume of different product categories. And this is that. And I also asked them how much they would ideally like to consume. And I found that participants reported that ideally they would like to consume significantly less eggs, dairy, and meat products. And the main motivation for this were the animals before environment and health. But now, of course, the more interesting question is, what effects did my intervention have? And specifically, which strategy performed better and why? So you might remember my predictions. I actually expected Neve to produce less adverse outcomes and Abby more favorable ones. And here's what I found. So as predicted, Neve produced significantly less vegophobia, so less negative feelings towards vegans. She also produced tendencially less rejection of vegan products and tendencially stronger reduction in tensions. The latter is against my expectations. And I didn't find any meaningful effects on the remaining variables. So far, Neve is the better option because she produced less adverse outcomes and slightly more favorable ones with a stronger reduction in tensions. But now the next question is, what explains these effects? So here's where my theoretical model comes into play. And I tested whether the threat categories and the emotions can explain those effects. And what I found here was that rights threat actually played a central role because it explained at least partially all three of those effects. So what happened was that Nebe was perceived as less threatening to people's rights, and that explained her favorable effect on reduction in tensions. It also explained why she produced less anger and therefore less adverse outcomes. Now, Nebe was also perceived as less threatening to people's worldviews, and that also helped explaining why she produced less vegophobia. Now, interestingly, there was a significant part of anger that was not explained by any of the threat categories I tested for. So this indicates that there is probably still something missing in the model. So far, the takeaway is that Nebe performed better overall. And the reason for that was that she was perceived as less threatening to people's rights and worldviews, and she also made them less angry. So are there any exceptions? And the first question I ask myself here, does the diet of the recipient matter? So here I looked at two dietary groups. The first one, reducers. These are people who had already reduced their consumption of animal products somehow. And in my sample, most of these were vegetarians. And I compared those with unrestricted eaters, so people who have absolutely no restrictions on animal product consumption. And first, I looked at how these dietary groups differed before the intervention. And what I found here was that reducers reported significantly more positive attitudes towards vegans and veganism, and also more favorable change intentions and efforts. But now the more interesting question is, how will they respond to the vegan messages, especially when they are a little bit more radical, like Abby's message? Actually, this is something I'd like to ask you as well. What do you think? Do you think that the reducers respond more favorably, or responded in my experiment more favorably to the abolitionist message than the unrestricted eaters? Put a 1 if you believe that is the case, and maybe a 0 if you believe it's not the case. Any guesses? Okay, we have one guess, a 1, another one more ones. Yeah, that was my guess as well, actually. More ones. I was pretty sure that the reducers would respond more favorably to Abby's message, and was pretty surprised when this wasn't the case. Reducers actually responded especially adversely, with significantly more anger and significantly more vegophobia than unrestricted eaters. Then again, I thought maybe that doesn't matter that much. I mean, maybe they will still change towards veganism since they had such positive attitudes towards it. And I don't really care if people get angry with me or don't like me, as long as it works. So I looked at how anger is associated with favorable change intentions and efforts. Now, what I found here was that the more anger reducers reported, and reducers are the bright green lines here, so the more anger they reported, the less favorable change intentions and efforts they reported. So it seems it might be a good idea to try and avoid triggering anger. Question is, of course, how? So I looked at where the anger is coming from, and again, I found that rights threat explained a considerable part. Again, there was a significant part of anger that was not explained by rights threat or any of the other threat categories, again indicating that there is something missing in the model, most probably. But so far, we can maybe take away that we should maybe be a little bit cautious when speaking to reducers and try and not to make these people angry. So next question is Abby actually ever the better option? And to make it short, yes, she is. There were instances when Abby really outperformed Nebe. This is what you can see here. Now, in these cases, Abby produced significantly more morality threat, which is this awareness of injustice towards animals, and she produced tendentially stronger elimination intention, so the intention to go vegan. And this was the case only when worldview threat was low. So when people had or perceived the message as being in alignment with their values and beliefs, with their worldviews, when this was the case, EBI was really good. However, when this wasn't the case, so when worldview threat was high, when people perceived the message as clashing with their worldviews, then she was unfortunately quite counterproductive. Now, this is what you can see here. Now, these are post minus pre-difference scores. So meaning anything below 0 indicates a reduction in comparison to the pre-test. So what you can see here is that people actually reduced their morality threat, so their awareness of injustice, and they reduced their favorable change intentions and efforts. So to summarize, yes, EBI can have superior transformational power, but she can also be quite counterproductive. Nevertheless, I believe that we have a huge opportunity here, and I will get back to this later on. For now, I have one last question, and that is the theoretical model I introduced in the beginning, is it actually helpful? Because so far we have seen that rights threat and worldview threat seem to be relevant with regard to some of the outcomes, but what about threats to health and morality? Is this actually relevant? So what I did here was I looked at the associations between the threat categories and the outcomes at the time of the pretest, so before the intervention. And what I'm actually going to set the emotions aside to keep things a little bit more digestible here. So what I found here was that rights threat and worldview threat were again associated with more adverse outcomes, specifically vegaphobia and rejection of vegan products. Then health threat was associated with more adverse outcomes, and this was significant for all the adverse outcomes. And health threat was also associated with less favorable outcomes, which was significant for all the favorable outcomes except elimination effort. Now, for morality threat, the exact opposite was the case, pretty much as expected. So morality threat was associated with more favorable outcomes and less adverse outcomes. And this was significant for all the outcomes I was interested in. So what's the takeaway here? Now, we have to be a little bit careful with the causality here because these are correlational analyses. Nevertheless, what they seem to suggest is that all 4 threat categories are relevant with regard to some of the outcomes at least. And morality threat seems to be really an important and beneficial predictor here. So what's my conclusion? How can we get now to a vegan world? Well, I believe based on my findings that we might be able to get a little bit closer to this goal by using advocacy that keeps threats to rights, health, and worldviews as low as possible and at the same time increases morality threat. And we have seen a few ways of how to achieve that. For example, we can increase morality threat using EBI's strategy, but that works only when we can keep threats to worldviews low. The way to do this is to try and align the message with people's values and beliefs with their worldviews. If we can't do that, or if it doesn't work, based on my findings, I would suggest to switch to Neve's strategy in order to avoid these counterproductive effects. And using Neve's strategy, we can also quite effectively avoid these rights threats. But now I actually want to take this a step further, and this is where I'm currently at. So it's a little bit work in progress. Nevertheless, I want to give you a bit of a sneak peek. So first of all, I think that we have a huge opportunity, as mentioned before, when we use these strategies in an adaptive manner. So depending on whether or not we expect a high or a low worldview threat, we choose the strategy. Why? Because we have seen that the new welfare strategy produces these moderately positive effects. Then the abolitionist strategy, depending on whether worldview threat is low or high, produces either very positive or very negative effects. So by using these in an adaptive manner, we might be able to harness these superior effects of EBI when worldview threat is low. But when worldview threat is high, instead of producing the counterproductive effects, we can maybe switch to Neves strategy and that way at least produce these moderately positive effects. So that overall, we would be looking at something like that. And the adaptive strategy could therefore outperform the other two. Now, of course, the question is, how do we now know if worldview threat will be high or low? Now, unfortunately, at this point in time, I don't really know, because the way I measured worldview threat left quite a lot of room for interpretation. So this is actually something I'm currently looking into. What exactly is worldview threat? What triggers it? And how can we use this information strategically in order to come up with a decision rule here? Then there is something else I'm looking into, and this is how can we modulate these threat perceptions in an optimal way? So basically, I'm asking myself the question, how can we best keep unhelpful threats as low as possible, while at the same time increasing injustice awareness and maximize positive effects? And the unhelpful threats here are, of course, threats to rights, health, and worldviews, but also moral reproach, which is basically a perceived negative evaluation. And this is something I believe is still missing in my model. So what I'm doing here is I took a step back and really dismantled the strategies, looked into literature again, and what I found particularly interesting was motivational interviewing, which already is part of Neves' strategy. But now I'm really digging a little bit deeper and trying to pinpoint certain or specific strategy elements that we can use to really modulate these threats in an optimal way. And there are two reasons why I find motivational interviewing so interesting. First of all, because studies show that when people feel pushed or patronized, told what to do, or morally judged, then they tend to shut down and change becomes less likely. And what motivational interviewing did was that they developed specific techniques that really create an autonomy supportive and psychologically safe environment. And some key elements here are, first of all, acceptance and like a mindset or an attitude of genuine interest and curiosity, and also an autonomy supportive communication style. So we might be able to convey this by maybe saying, like, I'm really interested in what you think about this, or we are not here to convince or judge you. And maybe also ask for consent. So in a way, it's a little bit like assuming the role of quite a neutral interviewer. But according to MI, we can then use reflections and open questions to guide the conversation and to really strengthen change motivation and intentions. So here, for example, when people talk about how important animal welfare is to them, which a lot of people do, we can reflect this back by saying you care a lot about animals, which often triggers more of this change talk. Or we can ask open questions like, in an ideal world, what life would you imagine for animals? And then maybe contrast this with the reality and ask what people would be willing to do. Now, the question here is, of course, what do we do when people say it is okay for them that animals are killed, or it is okay for them that animals are used, and it's only a matter of how? When and how can or should we push this further? Like, when does EBI come into play? And my findings suggest that EBI's arguments, these kind of moral arguments, can be really effective as long as they are perceived as being in alignment with people's worldviews. And as you know, so far, I don't really have a decision rule here. But what I can maybe recommend is to try and introduce these slightly more radical moral arguments with some caution, and maybe wrap them up in a personal story, or use framings like frame them as a personal opinion, a personal experience, and ask people what they think about it. And I think the last part is especially important: remain open and curious and accepting, even if they disagree. And I know this is probably difficult, and some of you might disagree at this point as well, but I think this is crucial because there are only so many people we can reach with the abolitionist argument. And I believe it does matter what happens to the rest, and whether we push these people into outright opposition or whether we manage to nudge them at least a little bit into our direction, which I believe can be more conducive to the movement overall. And I'm sure there will be different opinions about this, and I already see it in the chat. I'm really looking forward to discuss this with you. I have a few last points I want to make. First of all, these strategy elements, some of them are evidence-informed or evidence-based, but others are still very much work in progress and need to be tested. Then some conclusions you might have noticed are based on exploratory and correlational analysis. And of course, longitudinal effects are mostly unknown. Like, as I mentioned, most of my post measures were obtained directly after the intervention. Only effort was measured a couple of weeks afterwards. And this is actually, there's very little research when it comes to longitudinal effects. So we don't really know much of what happens further down the line. So there is definitely more research needed. Then regarding the chatbots, I had a little bit of trouble. They didn't always fully adhere to the prompts, but overall they did quite a good job. And I also believe that AI chatbots can be a really promising tool in vegan advocacy because, for one, they are infinitely scalable. They can really have thousands of conversations at the same time. And I believe this can be really effective. So what's next for me? Well, I really want to develop this optimized adaptive strategy further, then eventually test it as well. I'm also interested in looking into other promising strategies. I find the coaching-inspired approach from We the Free quite interesting because also coaching is inherently autonomy supportive, and therefore this could be really effective as well. And in general, I'm really interested in exploring ways to maximize impact using AI. And if you're interested in my work, you can follow along at Sci for Veganism on Instagram or also LinkedIn. And yeah, this was probably quite a lot of input. So I have here summarized my main takeaways. First of all, overall, Nebel performed better, but depending on worldview threat, whether it was low or high, Abby was either quite transformational or counterproductive, which is why I believe that an adaptive approach could perform better overall. And then also based on my findings, it might be a good idea to try and keep threats to rights, health, and worldviews as low as possible, and at the same time increase awareness of injustice, which is morality threat. If you like to dig a bit deeper and also find all the references, you can do this in my thesis, and I'm going to leave the QR code here on the bottom left corner. With this, I'm nearly at the end, so I want to thank you for your attention, and special thanks to Paul from Vegans Are Discussing for inviting me, and also my thesis advisors and my family. And here's all my contact details. And with this, I'm at the end. Thank you so much.
So, thank you, Antonia. Thanks for the really interesting talk. I'm just going to stop the recording now.